This is the eLearn Podcast, episode 85.
And one aspect of when you relate to that whole working memory aspect is think about going to a grocery store without a list, right? It would be really challenging for most of us to go to a grocery store if we have more than 3 items on our list, maybe 5, and be able to execute that with proficiency, right?
Mm-hmm.
And our learners are constantly having to take in information, hold on to it, then pull from other aspects of their brain to make those connections. So us adults have learned how to use a list.
Welcome to the eLearn Podcast. My name is Laddick, and I'm your host from OpenLMS. My guest for today is Jess Corinne, who's the head of educational services at Learnfully. Her passion is making sure that instructors have the tools they need to effectively serve learners with special needs. In this educational conversation, Jess and I discuss what it means to be the head of educational services for Learnfully and how her work impacts and oversees all of the organization's delivery for families and learners. We also talk about what exactly executive functioning is and how it's the gateway for basically everything that happens in your brain and the 3 buckets these functions fall into. We also have a very detailed conversation with some super clear examples of the 8 component subskills underneath those 3 major buckets, and why all of us, yes, even if you think that you're entirely normal, deal with issues related to executive functioning in one way or another. We also talk about why neuroplasticity is alive and well and is so important, and how our brains shift, mold, and strengthen synaptic connections so that we can continue to adapt to the world, and how you can consciously retrain yourself and your brain for new situations. We also talk about why we really need to accept that the goalposts are always changing in life, and learning to enjoy the journey through adapting results in the most fulfillment and satisfaction. And finally, we end with Jess's recommendation for using sensory language with instructions for your learners and how that can help them to understand how they learn and ultimately improve themselves over time. And just a note about the format of this episode, I've started to move all the interviews to a live format so that we can interact with you, our listeners. In this episode, you'll hear Jess and I answer questions as they come in via chat messages. I invite you to join us every Thursday on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. But before we get started, a quick word from our sponsors.
The eLearning Podcast is sponsored by the eLearn Success Series, a uniquely valuable set of events that bring together sector experts and thought leaders to offer solutions to the most critical challenges and issues at the intersection of education and technology. Get your free ticket to all 4 sessions at elearnsuccessseries.com. And OpenLMS, a company that provides world-class LMS solutions that empower organizations to meet education and workplace learning needs. Learn more by visiting openlms.net.
Hello, welcome to the eLearning Hot Seat. My name's Laddick. How is everybody today? I hope that guess what? It's December 14th already, which,
Bonkers.
Blows my mind. I'm here with Jess Corinne. Jess, you're the head of educational services at Learnfully. How are you today?
I am. Yes, I can give you a quick background if you'd like.
Yeah, I would love it. We had one of your colleagues, Suchi, on the show a couple weeks ago, and we had lots of great feedback. Said, look, we want to go deeper. We want to learn more about neuroplasticity, about executive functioning, what we're going to talk about today, etc. So why don't you give us a background about where you are?
I'd love to. So I started my career in education as a classroom teacher. I was super excited and juiced to dive into the classroom and apply everything that I had learned. But I think this is a really common experience in that I felt that I didn't have the tools. I didn't feel equipped to serve learners who learn differently. So I joined forces with Linda Mood-Bell Learning Processes, and they're an organization that's really refined the art of multisensory evidence-based teaching. So I felt like I really could get the training, the development, the implementation experience that I needed to ensure that I had all the tools to serve learners in the way that they needed and deserved. And that's where I learned a lot about executive functioning. So I took that experience, I opened my private practice, served in the Bay Area for quite a few years, consulted with schools, a pediatrician's practice, oversaw instruction as a whole. And that's what brought me to Learnfully. So now I'm the head of educational services here at Learnfully.
What does that mean? Head of Educational Services. When is that? Are you designing curriculum? Are you overseeing a bunch of the instructors, consultants, et cetera, that kind of thing? Or what does that mean?
Yes. All of the above. So head of educational services means I oversee the quality of implementation. So I make sure that our instructional recommendations are meeting the needs of our learners. And there's a thorough process at which we apply that. So we start with an assessment to pinpoint where the breakdown is happening. And then based on the findings, based on their performance, their potential, we delineate initial recommendations for programming. And so I help with the recommendation process. I help oversee the implementation, the quality and fidelity thereof. And then I also train and develop our educational specialist network.
Okay. Wow. I mean, it's just a tiny little job.
Yeah, I absolutely love it. Right up my alley.
I want to remind everybody who's listening now, first of all, thank you for joining us. My name is Ladek. This is Jess Corinne. She's the head of educational services at Learnfully. We actually are right now, if you're listening, it's December 14th, 10 a.m. Eastern time. We are live. So if you do have a question, if you want to have a comment, you want to share an experience, if you're on LinkedIn, if you're on Facebook, if you are on YouTube right now, throw it at us. That's what we're here for. We have these hot seats. I mean, we called it hot seat for a reason, right? We want to put Jess on the spot.
Bring it on.
But before we do get started with that, first of all, thank you very much to Anne for throwing your question in there right now. I will come back to it in a second. Let me tee up the conversation and then we'll come back to you.
Do it.
We want to focus today on executive functioning as it overall, and then as it sort of relates to neuroplasticity and neurodiversity and those kinds of things. But give us the baseline. What is executive functioning? What does this mean? Why is this important, et cetera?
Would love to. So I believe strongly, wholeheartedly, that executive functioning is like the precursor to many learning differences. And the reason for that is that the executive functioning abilities are housed in the prefrontal cortex of your brain. And so that is like the gate that allows information to streamline into the different components of your brain that are responsible for literacy, language processing skills, mathematical abilities. So executive functioning in the front of your brain, if it's weak, if you have executive dysfunction, it serves as a blockage. And I'll define what that means in a moment. But the importance is if it's blocking your brain's neuroplasticity, right? The ability to then transfer information to the relative areas, you're not able to meet your potential. And so I feel like there's a ton of education that needs to happen around executive functioning. You'd be surprised at how many people I talk to who can relate to the different component skills within executive functioning, but don't know the term itself. I'm so grateful that we're talking about it today. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah. Go ahead.
To define it. So executive functioning as a whole, some see it as like the CEO of your brain. I see it as the conductor of your brain, because the role of the conductor is so closely aligned to executive functioning as a whole. And what that means, it's a really broad stroke term for 3 buckets of skills that then branch out into 8 more channels or buckets. So it's a lot of complexity here.
You're right. I'm literally pulling my notebook out right now because we have to take notes here.
Welcome. Yeah, welcome to my college course. So executive functioning, there's 3 different avenues or channels. One is working memory. And that's your brain's ability to activate prior knowledge, hold on to information that you're interacting or engaging with, and be able to connect the two. So it's your brain's ability to automatically retrieve information and then do something with it. So a lot of the reason why some of our learners struggle in reading, spelling, automaticity of math facts like multiplication is they can't hold on to that memory for long enough in order to retrieve prior information and make the connections. You can see why that's a problem, right? So
100%.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So if you can't sustain attention, if you can't then make those connections, then it's really difficult for you to succeed educationally and beyond. The 2 other buckets are mental flexibility. So being able to switch at a dime, being able to self-regulate, control your impulses, that sort of thing.
Is this connected with like an emotional center kind of?
It is because that is also in the prefrontal cortex, right? The amygdala is the emotional center, and hippocampus. Those 2 work side by side with memory and emotion. And so if you're unable to regulate yourself. The self-control bucket comes in. And then you might call out in class. You might have outbursts, reactions that are unexpected. You won't be able to initiate tasks, organize yourself, plan or prioritize. So all of these different inner workings really allow us to respond to daily activities with efficacy and efficiency. And without that ability, then you can't even get to the point where you're able to really engage with academic and information in general.
As another result as well, just the way that we tend to describe things is, as you said, like outbursts, or, sort of the, what's the word I'm looking for? Let's just leave it there, sort of outbursts. But is another result sometimes, that kind of going inward where you're not responding at all, or you're just not engaging, or is that a different outcome that we would see?
No, absolutely. So when you look at self-regulation as a whole, there's many curriculums around heightening cognizance in our learners on how their alertness and energy levels can impact their ability to perform and engage. And some are low energy. So they might be really like you said, they focus inward. They might have a little more of like that blue tone where they're sad or bored or easily fatigued. And then you have others, such as myself, who live in more of a hyperactive, energetic zone. And so that means for me in school, I really needed to figure out how to channel my energy in a productive way so I could sustain attention, I could focus, I could follow through and initiate in what was being expected of me in the classroom and out. So yeah, there's a range. It's absolutely a spectrum, much like everything in the academic realm.
Super cool. So we've got these three kind of high level buckets, and there's,
yes.
I know we had talked about, we want to talk about these 8 pieces that then connect to them. Before we go down there, I want to thank Carlos Rosas for your question. But I think, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think we may have already answered it, because he asked, what are the neuronal correlates for executive functions? So he said, it seems the only thing with some evidence is working memory, but that sounded like that was like, that's overall working memory, but then it's those 3 buckets. Do we already?
Yeah. So working memory is one of the 3 buckets, right? And you can, I hear you, Carlos, you can measure working memory through evaluative processes. You can look at evidence-based and research studies for working memory. It's a little more difficult to gauge the other 2 because they're relative to the learner. So working memory absolutely is one that can be evidenced and measured and so forth scientifically. And then you can do the same for regulation and mental flexibility, but it's a little more gray. So you're not able to really apply as much research. There's not as many recent studies around it, which is why you have to focus a lot of the time on educating our community, because there's a lot left to be unknown.
Why is there any reason why the other 2 buckets wouldn't have as much research behind them, but other than working memory? Is it just because it's so new, like it's new to the stage?
It's new, yes, but it's also more difficult to measure. It's more difficult to quantify. When you're looking at mental flexibility, you can look at trials, you can look at the correlations thereof. Same with how to self-control. You can look at, take a tally chart or an antecedent behavioral consequence chart, but it is all relative. Right? Like for somebody who I can function at a really high level. So you can gauge my levels of alertness and energy based on heart rate, based on trials, right? But that's all relative. So working memory is the one of the 3 overarching buckets that you can quantify and then thus qualify in order to then delineate and correct or remediate.
I love that. This is awesome. This is fantastic. I've already learned more than I ever knew about executive functioning. So cool. Just a reminder to everyone who's listening right now, I'm with Jess Corinne. She's the head of educational services at Learnfully. We're talking about executive functioning as it relates to neuroplasticity, neurodiversity, etc. Jess, you've just talked about sort of the 3 major buckets in that executive functioning piece, but then they move into these 8 other pieces. And I know you were super psyched when we were in the green room earlier, telling you like, this is where it's all at. So why don't you take us there?
I mean, the complexity and density of executive functioning is the reason why I think so many people don't understand or know about it. And so I think as we walk through, I'll share some real life identifiers, some real life examples, so that as adults and learners alike, we all struggle with certain aspects of this, but it's how we function and cope through it. So let's do it. There's 8 component subskills. So areas such as task initiation and activation. How do you launch into a task without needing a lot of prompting or probing? Also redirection. So sustained attention. How long can you focus when given a specific activity or task? And then, of course, sustain that for a long period of time based on the expectations. This is really challenging for learners who struggle with executive functioning. And we see a lot of correlation between executive dysfunction and ADHD, as you can imagine. Sure. The flexible thinking. So really activating a growth mindset. How do you react with grace, with kind of calmness when something doesn't go your way, when you're faced with adversity? How you pivot. I think a lot of us have experienced the pivoting that needs to happen when faced with something that's unprecedented or unexpected. So, you know,
is that both good and bad? I mean,
I think it really gave us it still is giving us an opportunity to have perspective and take perspective with our learners who are constantly faced with the lack of control. When they're in a classroom, they have to follow an agenda that's set. They don't have much flexibility, much choice, and they have to be able to lean into that discomfort and figure out a way to embrace and remain flexible, which I would say us adults don't even have to do as often as kids have to do. So it's even more challenging. I mean, we're in somewhat control of our schedule, of our life choices, somewhat.
I was going to say, I guess there's a huge spectrum there. Of course.
That's totally. But for kids, they're in constant lack of control. So they have to be able to control their body and their reactions. And that's a bit of the flexible thinking, but that also is the self-regulation that we mentioned.
But
it's also,
before you go to the next one, that kind of some of the, for instance, everyone who's listened to the podcast or knows me, I have 3 kids, and we've been a part of sort of like the Montessori system, the open school system, these kinds of things. So when someone who has some of these challenges, or a learner has some of these challenges, if they're in a situation where it really is self-directed learning, does that make it more difficult, less difficult to identify some of these issues, or?
Yes, I would say so. I mean, I don't think there's been a ton of research around that matter, but I actually have 4 children, and 3 of whom went to a progressive community type environment at first in their early educational career. And now they're in a public school. And so I've been able to just personally and professionally be able to gauge the difference in how my children are developing executive functioning skills. It's more explicitly taught in public school. They have more direction. They have a little more structure than in our progressive Montessori type schools. And there's no judgment around that. Like, it's to each his own. If it works for that learner to move at their own pace and find themselves in that process, that's amazing. But for some, they need that structure, that systematic, explicit teaching in order for them to really benefit from the information being delivered.
And then, and as we found, in our life as well, you kind of move in and out of it, right? So the self-directed or that open sort of format really works well for some time, but then maybe you need that just sort of, look, here's how you create an agenda, here's how you take notes, here's how you get it done.
Exactly.
And then you can move back into, all right, now you've got those pieces that you've developed now. Okay, so now start making your own decisions. Anyway, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole because I think we're only on number 2.
I welcome
number
it.
2 or 3, right?
Okay, so then I think we've covered some of the buckets. Let me go back to self-monitoring is a big piece of this. So how do you monitor not just your output, your behavioral responses, but how do you also monitor academically? How do you go back and edit your work? How do you lean into revisions, make sure that you're checking things off your list, going back and checking your work, that kind of mindset. So that is really challenging for our learners who struggle with impulse control, which is another executive functioning skill, because they just want to move on. They kind of just want to rush through tasks, mentally check it off their list, and then go about their day in a way that they prefer, a preferred task. So self-monitoring and impulse control, sustained attention can all kind of go hand in hand. Organization and planning and prioritization skills also can kind of be integrated. They're correlated closely, at least. Organizational skills doesn't only relate to how you organize your materials. Like, my son struggles with many of these executive functioning skills, but he is super focused on organizing his materials. That said, he doesn't have an organized train of thought. He doesn't know how to organize his time. He doesn't know how to manage his time. Because he lacks that time estimation, that relational connection to space, if you will. So you may be able to function in one of these areas, but that doesn't automatically mean that the others come as easy to you. So organizational skills in terms of materials, train of thought, time management skills, and also how you plan and prioritize. A lot of our learners who struggle in this area, they don't like planners. They don't know how to actively use a planner, electronic or written. They struggle quite a bit with how to go through their weekly activities or tasks and chunk them out into smaller, more manageable parts. I think some adults, they struggle with that too.
I was going to say, I know quite a few adults who struggle with this. Time management is feel like that's a business industry. That's an industry in itself in the self-help universe, and especially in business and whatnot. That's really fascinating. Interesting.
Yeah. And, ways that you can go about just as an adult, we have these aspects that we can relate to in our learners' lives. And one aspect of when you relate to the whole working memory aspect is think about going to a grocery store without a list. Right? It would be really challenging for most of us to go to a grocery store if we have more than 3 items on our list, maybe 5, and be able to execute that with proficiency, right? And our learners are constantly having to take in information, hold on to it, then pull from other aspects of their brain to make those connections. So us adults have learned how to use a list. Right? We even use checklists throughout our day, or if we have certain things that we need to get done as parents, we write those down. So your working memory allows you to hold that information. So I would challenge you, if you do struggle with this, to try to go to the store and see how many items you can cross off your list without looking at your list. And then try to extend that 1 item per week or what have you, just to see if you can be more cognizant. One aspect of strengthening working memory is being aware of how you're processing information. How are you holding on to that information? A lot of us go through the day and we just memorize, right? We read words off the page, we digest them, but we don't really know how we're making that connection, how we're processing that information. So that metacognitive state that is within executive functioning, that learning how you learn best, can actually allow you to tap into that as a resource in some of these areas. So for working memory, since we're on that topic, I take in information and I create a visual representation. I make a picture in my mind, right? So when I was doing this task with myself, I would then picture myself walking through the grocery store and picking out which items I needed, or at least kind of compartmentalizing the areas within the grocery store. Creating that mental representation serves as a fundamental skill that you can pull on from the majority of these executive functioning skills. So to reiterate, it's just really important to figure out how you learn best so that you can use that as a framework to stand upon when it comes to applying all of these 8 component subskills.
That is absolutely fantastic. And I want to just kind of follow that thread as well. So often when we talk about neuroplasticity, neurodiversity, we start thinking about, in my brain, at least, the first thing that we think about is the child, right? Is someone who's in the sort of the elementary or primary or secondary school. But what you're describing as well is paying attention to and consistently working on our brain, working on these functions through your adult life as well. Am I exactly the same? Or?
Absolutely. I think, because we are lacking as a community in education and awareness around this concept. We just named it a number of years ago. So we didn't even have a name for the prefrontal cortex and the correlation between all these skills. So I think for us adults, it's really important that we think of real life examples that we can relate to, and then how those kind of trickle down to our learners and to our kids. And quite frankly, as we evolve, we are putting a lot on our learners to function executively. They're having to, we're in a pandemic. There's a lot of things going on where they're having to refrain their impulses, sustain longer periods of time. They're receiving a lot of immediate gratification from gaming and so forth. And so I think it's even more stressful on them to really activate some of these functioning skills. But I think it's really important for us parents, us adults, educators, to think of examples in our life and then how that can connect to our learners so that we can take perspective.
Fantastic. I want to remind everybody we're actually live right now. It's December 14th here, about 10:20 in the morning on the East Coast of the United States. If you do have a question that you'd like to ask about neuroplasticity, neurodiversity, executive functioning specifically, that's what we're talking about today with Jess Corinne. She's the head of educational services at Learnfully. Please do put it in the comments if you're on Facebook or LinkedIn or YouTube. We will see them, and we will. And I want to thank Carlos for your comment earlier, and also Anne. I will come back to your question. We're getting there pretty soon here. So where are we at in these 8 buckets? Have we gone?
We've covered all 8. Yeah.
Okay.
And I think it's important. You mentioned neuroplasticity. I'd love to define that for our audience. So it's my song and dance. I love it. I always say neuroplasticity is alive and well. It's the reason it's true. And it's so amazing and fascinating at the same time, because it's the reason why we're able to adjust and relate to some of these aspects. So let me define it for us. Neuroplasticity is your brain's ability to shift and mold and re-strengthen some of those synaptic connections. So you actually, by definition, can rewire the way that your brain is processing information. That is so important throughout our lives, but especially when it comes to executive functioning, because some of us face challenges in one or more of these 8 buckets, and we might feel defeatist, right? We might feel like we're unable to achieve and we have to use compensatory measures to get around them. But in reality, we can retrain the way that our brain is communicating with other aspects of our brain. For example, if we have executive functioning and we have an executive dysfunction, so we have a weakness in this area, it serves like a stress fog, right? All of a sudden, the uptick in anxiety we're all facing as a society has really allowed that gate, that break, so that our learners are not able to take their executive functioning skills, even if they're strong, and then tap them into different areas of the brain. So if you have to, let's say you're struggling with paying attention, then how can those synaptic connections actually reach the back of your brain? And that area of the Broca or Wernicke area is really responsible for language processing skills. So if you can't sustain attention, you're not taking in information, you're not processing and all the teaching that's happening around you. And so it's kind of like a blank slate at that point. So you can actually use evidence-based multisensory instructional models to retrain these pathways in your brain. We see it in light up technology, right? When people have the scans, you're able to actually see from pre to post instruction how these aspects and these certain component subskills in your brain are reactivated through repetitious, consistent instruction. So I think it's amazing. And executive functioning is like the preface to all of that, because if that isn't in place, then there's absolutely no way that you can activate and tap into those other aspects of your brain that allow you to not only realize, but reach your full learning potential.
I want to re-emphasize or emphasize what you're discussing here. One of our favorite guests on the show, her name is Dr. Britt Andrietta. And she talks about the brain science, of leadership, of, learning, of teaching, et cetera, et cetera. And in one of her last talks that we were talking about, it describes exactly what you were saying there, where it's like the power of habit, right? When you do something over and over again, that you can actually measure the synapses and the neurons growing.
Yes.
So, I think don't quote me, but she said something like 40 repetitions to like get something so that it's thick enough that it actually creates a new habit for yourself, or, it changes the shape of your brain, for lack of thing. That's that plasticity, so that you're actually, you have a new behavior, or you react differently to something or something like that. Do I have that correct?
Absolutely. Like, and I think it gives a lot of hope to our learners who are struggling in the prefrontal cortex, but beyond as well, in learning in general, is that with repetition, with consistency, with research-oriented methods, we're able to then reshape and rewire those aspects. Just like when I started working out or started running or a new routine, it takes a good 3 weeks for you to settle in to that new behavior, that new habit, after doing it on a daily basis. And the same goes for some of these behaviors. So executive functioning is absolutely trainable, but it takes some time. It takes explicit teaching. It takes habit shaping, and then it takes some coaching on how to generalize and carry it over thereafter.
And there's a great example of, again, from my life. So my eldest son, he's recently, a teenager. He's now recently fascinated with becoming healthier, working out,
Great.
right? But one of the things that we all do is we
we jump into the deep end of the pool, right? We burn then, and then of course, then we burn out, and then, it's too hard. We struggle, this and that. And so one of the things we've been encouraging is, hey, look, let's walk into it, kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of baby steps, this and that. Is that something that you would do with mathematics, with language learning, whatever? It's like, hey, let's take little pieces and then build on it from there.
Absolutely. In psychology, they call it successive approximations, which is just a fancy way of saying small steps to big goals. You take it one step at a time for, yes, healthy life changes, but also for executive functioning and these learning behaviors. It's one step at a time. You want to be able to, it's like asking somebody who can't sustain attention for more than a few minutes to focus during a 20-minute lecture, during a 60-minute lecture. Like, imagine how much redirection has to go into that process, and how exhausting that is for learners. So to take someone who sustained attention period, which is about 5 minutes, and then to increase it a minute or so, right, every week, like giving it that stretch, because it is a sprint. It is a marathon, not a sprint, right? We want it to be a sprint. Gosh, don't we want it? We want quick change. I do too.
Sure, I want to learn Spanish immediately. I'm in the
right
city
away.
But
it's same for executive functioning. Like, you can't expect a learner who struggles in self-monitoring to all of a sudden start using a writing rubric, extensive comprehensive writing rubric. You have to start with maybe 2 or 3 things that they need to go back and edit their work or check for. And then you advance that, you increase it. So it's all about chunking, really, and doing these small steps, like you said, the baby steps to get to this larger goal. But let's be honest too, when you look at a learner's trajectory in the educational world, the goalpost is constantly moving. Same with us adults, right? We get to a level where we're able to run a mile. Well, guess what? I want to run 2. And then you want it, like, it just keeps changing. So I think that's where the flexibility, the growth mindset, the impulse control, being able to take a step back and realize that we're in it for the journey, we're in it for the process, and finding joy in and reward through each of those steps, I think, is just as important as the end result.
And not to get too esoteric in this moment, but all of this is coming together right now and making sense to me as a parent as well, where, the schools we've gone to, many of the leadership individuals there have talked about, said, look, it's not necessarily the 2 + 2 = 4 skills that we're looking at so much. It's the, can I work in a group? Can I be creative? Can I take a situation just because of the amount of change?
100%.
Just the pace of the universe is only going to continue to skyrocket. And so that's why those are the most critical skills. Like, what we're talking about today are literally the most essential skills for success. Just to be happy as a human going forward.
Oh, and finding joy in the life, and not in each successive goal, right? And I think that's really important. There's a lot of research around how your EQ can actually advance you through adulthood more successfully than your IQ. And there's a lot of research behind that. So I think we're, as a community, as a society, we're really doing a great job focusing on executive functioning and social emotional learning, because how you're able to problem solve, collaborate, it's really the learning how you learn and not what you learn. So not necessarily succumbing to the pressures of content and curriculum, but more so processing and coping skills, so that you can face adversity throughout your life. I mean, there's always going to be a new challenge. So it's really how you approach that with confidence and success without feeling overwhelmed and burdened by the process.
Fantastic. Another public service announcement here. I'm live with Jess Corinne. She's the head of educational services at Learnfully. We're going to be on here for a little while longer. If you're on Facebook or YouTube or LinkedIn, please, we are taking questions and comments right now. It's December 14th. If you're listening to the recording of this, you can still put them in the comments. We'll answer them later. But I want to finally now come back to Anne Herman-Nedhi. I hope I didn't destroy your name, Anne. But so now this takes us to a place where, we've talked about executive functioning. We've talked about the importance of it, et cetera. You've given us clear examples of how this shows up, but now what can be done about it? So sure. Anne's question is, what's the best thing I can do to help a 2.5-year-old who has been identified as autistic? Like, or maybe that, you can replace autistic with ADHD or ADD or any of these different pieces of neurodiversity. What do we do, either as a parent or as an adult? For myself, like what are the first steps?
It's always the question, right? So we've developed at Learnfully an executive functioning simulation that allows educators and parents to really experience executive dysfunction and have a debrief discussion thereafter. And it's mind-blowingly rewarding to see the impact of the simulation. But after every single one, the one question we get is like, so now what? What do we do about this? And I absolutely will give you quick tips and tricks that you can apply. But to answer your question directly, Anne, every learner is different. And so to answer, when a 2.5-year-old is diagnosed with anything, especially with autism, it's really important to utilize your ecosystem. I believe strongly that it's all about collaboration and making sure that you're approaching this as a village, because you will find many experts in your life who can help you and direct you and guide you based on your learner's needs. So I can give you some really broad stroke answers to that question. We can converse offline, but I think ultimately I would need way more information when it comes to any individual in particular, because we want to see them. We want to be able to understand them as the unique learner they are. So a few strategies that you can use, but please don't assume that this is going to work for everybody, because everybody is different. That's the beauty of neurodiversity, is making sure that you're applying those small steps to big goals mentality. So chunking in life, right? Using the ability to break tasks down into manageable parts. So for example, and that's different for each age range and each grade. We actually, and I can point you in the direction, there's milestones online. If you ever want to research them, feel free to just type in executive functioning by age or grade. And there's quite a few that pop up. I think one in particular that we use is lifeskills.org, something like that. I could be mistaken. But essentially, it's important to know what's expected first of your learner. Like, we can't assume that our 2-year-old can sustain tension beyond 5 minutes, right? So we have to know exactly what's expected and what's relatively normal in that range, and then work towards that. So taking for example, a 5-year-old, I have a 5-year-old who leaves a trail behind him, and he has no clue that he's doing it, right? We call it La La Land. He loves it. He loves being in La La Land, and he embraces his la-la-ness. But he'll leave a trail. So each day, each week, I should say, but every day throughout the week, we challenge him to like pick up one extra thing. Right? So just one thing extra a day. Yesterday, he picked up one shoe, left the other, but he picked up one shoe, and that was a victory, right? And again, you're doing chunks, but you're also heightening cognizance. Like, hey, bud, have we done our one thing today? And sometimes he'll actually take initiative and pick up more without being asked. And so it's this idea of, again, making it doable, making it reachable so our learners can feel seen, feel heard, feel successful, but all the while just starting to extend that. Like, maybe next week we'll say 2 things, right? Just a little bit as he approaches that goalpost that we've discussed, extending it a little bit further. Some people like quick fixes. They like to think that a checklist will do the job, and it won't necessarily be the magic wand. So, but for me, I do use a checklist by the front door for their morning routine. I do have a checklist upstairs that's visual for their night routine. And the more they see that, the more it ingrains this habit, this pattern, this expectation, and they can then generalize that into different aspects of their life. I really, just if we have time, I'd love to give the tip that I love most about working memory is utilizing sensory-based language so that you can draw awareness around this idea of making movies in your mind, making pictures in your mind. So when you're working with your child at home, whether it be on a spelling list, on multiplication facts, even just giving them oral directions, I want you to try to sprinkle in some sensory-based language. So I want you to ask them, what letters do you picture for this word, whatever spelling it word they are, to see in their mind so they can be aware of that working memory, that blackboard in their brain. What numbers? Let's say I want you to picture 4 times 2. What does that look like? Some may actually picture the static imprint, the letters or numbers. Some might picture the concept. And it's okay either way. We just have to draw awareness on what works best for them. Then if you're giving directions, I know this is a pain point for many parents, many caregivers, many educators. When you're giving directions, I really want them to hone in on picturing themselves executing the directions, just like that grocery list, right? I want them to take in the information. So you say, I want you to picture yourself going upstairs, brushing your teeth, and putting on your PJs. What do you picture yourself doing? So first they see themselves doing it. They repeat it back to you to make that imagery language connection, and then they execute upon it. And you can start with one direction. You can move into 2 directions, 3 directions, making sure that you're conscious of the fact that your directions could be also multi-layered. So if a teacher says, go grab your book, like you're actually having to get out of your chair, find where that book is, find it on the shelf, pull it out, sit down. So that's a multi-layered one-step direction, right? So just be conscious of what you're asking your child to do. And then when doing so, try to sprinkle in as much sensory-based language so they can tap into that whiteboard, that blackboard, the mind's eye, so they can utilize it as a resource when they're in class and they're receiving a bunch of information. We don't want them to be a blank slate. We want them to be making this mental movie, this illustration, this narrative as they process information so they can utilize it and activate it at a later point.
This is all the excellent information, not only for a parent working with a child, but I want to draw it out again to adults, adult learners, professionals.
For sure.
This is all, I'm just thinking about, wow, do I do any of this stuff? Do I think about how I think? How often do I say, wow, I have a project that I have to complete over the next 6 months.
Let's visualize it.
How do I visualize it? How do I break it down? And that's just, this is all really, great fundamental stuff just about, working with our brains so that we, can we achieve those outcomes that we need to achieve. It's fantastic.
You'd be surprised at how often you do it inherently. I think as adults, we do it inherently. Although when I learned this methodology, I swear I was a memorizer. Like I crammed for all my college tests, 4.0 student, but I would highlight the entire textbook. I would wake up at 4 a.m. every day. I would study and cram. And then I lose the information until I realized that I should have been generating and conjuring these images. And so I would say most adults actually do it inherently where they're reading a novel, they're making the movie in their mind. They go and see the actual movie and they're disappointed.
But how much stress can I reduce in my life?
For sure.
By being conscious of it.
Yeah.
Right. By saying, okay, look, rather than diving into the project or diving into the meeting or diving into whatever conversation relationship that I've got going on, I'm going to take 2 minutes and just like take that deep breath and think about what's the outcome that I want and actually visualize. Like I can see how powerful that would be for so many, adults in my life of just thinking about thinking first and then executing on it. Right. So
yes. And it is applicable to all aspects of our life. Like, just like you said, in terms of setting goals, in terms of making plans and prioritizing, but what you do in that moment, other than the fact that you're like kind of concretizing or anchoring the information, is that you're releasing the stress fog, that anxiety block. So, I mean, just even mindfulness for learners, taking a few minutes to just take, a deep breath, find some of these self-regulatory tools that work for them. My children love making glitter jars. They shake them and we talk about settling your glitter. Like just chill and take a minute to learn how you are able to relax yourself. Because without that, even if you have strong executive functioning skills, you have an anxiety block and you can't then correspond with different areas of your brain. So visualization helps not only in like executive functioning, but also in relieving that tension so that you can maximize your executive functioning skills.
Super cool. I want to come back to another question that Carlos Rosas, pardon me.
Yes, please.
So he asks, if you ask for what is learning, everyone seems to have a different answer. So what kind of answers are useful for teachers when I assume, parents come and say, what is learning? Or, leadership says, hey, how do we show that learning is happening? Or a district or, say, how do we, do you have a sense of how to answer that question?
Gosh, as soon as you said that, I do believe in showing a learner their successes. So I think sometimes those district assessments that my children face every 9 weeks of the school year, it allows them an opportunity to see their successes, but it can work the opposite direction too. So I hate to answer this in a gray kind of confusing place, but I really think that it's individual. I think learning that's why differentiation is key. I think learning is different for each and every learner. Like what I gauge as a success might not be the same for another learner, which means as educators, we're faced with quite a challenge. How do you show progress? So I think that, setting baselines is important. I think monitoring whatever your goal is, whether it's executive functioning or academic based, I really believe in the power of delineating your goals and being able to use those as a baseline and then creating milestones to work towards your next marker, your next place of, testing, it depends on the learner. I think testing itself, just to answer that specific part of the question, it ignites a little bit of anxiety and a lot of it for some learners, and then they're not able to show what they know. So I think that using the power and beauty of differentiation, knowing how your learners learn best, and being able to then integrate personalized and different ways that they can show their knowledge, such as a video versus a written book report versus a cardboard box story or whatever it is, that allows them to embrace who they are as a learner, show their knowledge, and really learn how they learn best so they can advocate when they're older.
Yeah. I also love speaking with at least my children, or as they're, having to do tests and having to go through these things. There are important pieces, as you were saying, your children are in public school, of, look, we need to test the knowledge. We need to see where you're at. We need to see, did you get the concept, those kinds of things.
I get
it. But I always love watching their little brains kind of explode when I say, look, I don't know of any job in the world where you can't use all of the resources and all of the people possible to try to answer the question. And working in a group and sharing information is actually, that's celebrated, like there's no job I know of where it's like, go sit in a room and you can't talk to anyone and you can't look at anything, but you have to come up with the answer. Right. So it's important to continue to remind them or educate them or show them that, as this is how we are successful in life. Right. But there are these other little pieces that we do now.
Yeah, but it's also teaching them how to respond. Like you said, it's giving perspective, how to respond to this information, making sure they're clear that their test results don't define them, that there's other elements that allow them to be successful, and finding their way, finding their channel is more important than those results. But I learned how I learned as through test taking, right? Like I figured out a way that I learn best and that can help me in my career advance. So I think that there's it's a balance, right? And as long as the learner has an ability to show their knowledge in a diversity of ways, I think that's extremely important as an educator.
So my final question for you is around all of this super important information around executive functioning, neuroplasticity, neurodiversity, et cetera. What am I doing either as a parent, as an individual for myself, or as, with other adults to identify executive functioning issues? What are some of the, and I say this as an adult too, because I just met a new friend, and she told me over the pandemic, she was identified as, autistic. She's on that spectrum, with Asperger's. And that was, she's a woman in her 30s. Like, this is a new discovery for her. And so what are the signs? What am I looking for?
Well, that I could answer.
Is this another book?
Maybe we need another chat. But I will say it is very common for especially adult women to go undiagnosed for a long time. Because and I can't generalize, and I don't want to come off as generalizing, but for some people, their symptoms of executive dysfunction, of ADHD, of autism, of even dyslexia, to be frank, it comes out in a different way. And it's not as blatant, right? Like, they're compliant, they compensate, they tap into their resources, they figure out a way to cope and work through the system. I was one of those. Again, performed very well. No one knew I was struggling because I found a way to work through the system. So it's hard to really pinpoint exactly what you should look for. But I think that once you have knowledge around what executive functioning entails, working memory, self-control, sustaining attention, organizing your life as a whole, monitoring yourself. Once you have the awareness, then you can really tap into how it pertains to your individual life. And if you feel like you struggle in these areas, I've had quite a few friends say, this is what I've been missing my whole life. I have executive dysfunction. This is it right here. And it's because we haven't had enough conversation, enough education around the topic. So if you feel like you fit into one of these, you might only struggle with one, but it's still fair to say you have executive dysfunction. Reach out. Find somebody who can support you. We go through, the caregivers go through an inventory process where they take an executive functioning inventory. Our learners take an executive functioning inventory. We pair and correlate those two results and come up with a plan. But so reach out to us if you want us to work through that process with you. But quite honestly, you as an adult can intrinsically dig deep and be able to pinpoint where your breakdown is happening, and then reach out to a specialist to guide you in a differentiated approach. So as to how you can strengthen those areas of executive dysfunction.
Jess Corinne, I'm going to put a pin in it there. You are the head of educational services at Learnfully. This has been an absolutely fantastic conversation.
Thank
I cannot
you.
thank you enough for joining us here. Again, if you are watching the recording of this on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on YouTube, please feel free to put a question or a comment, in the on the screen there, and we will look at it. Jess will look at it, and we can get back to you as well. But thank you once again for taking the time out of your morning to speak with us today. I look
Thank
forward
you
to
for
speaking with you
having
again sometime in the
me.
future.
Absolutely. I would love to come back at any point. I welcome questions as they spill in. So thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Have a wonderful day.
You too. Take care.
Thanks again for tuning into today's episode of the E-Learning Podcast. If you like what you heard, please do me the favor of following us on LinkedIn, Twitter, or whichever social media you prefer. Also, if you're interested in diving deeper on e-learning, I encourage you to get your free ticket to the E-Learning Success Summit, where there are more than 70 hours of presentations on best practices. Just go to elearningsuccesssummit.com. And then finally, for the latest news, information, and resources about e-learning, come subscribe to our newsletter at lmspulse.com. Thanks.